Welcome to The Test is History, an illustrated journey into Test cricket's greatest matches. This episode focuses on Test number 135, the first Test of the 1920-21 series between Australia and England, which took place at the Sydney Cricket Ground from the 17th to the 22nd of December 1920. England's tour of Australia in 1920-21 provided the only Ashes whitewash of the 20th century. It was the first series after the Great War, and English cricket was still in a period of recovery. A generation of players had been lost in the battlefield, or at best seen their development disrupted. As such, England's senior cricket administrator, Lord Harris, aware of a team in transition, resisted resuming Test cricket in the immediate aftermath of the ceasefire. So, the 1920-21 touring party had a makeshift feel to it. From the outset, it was clear that sourcing cricketers was a far from straightforward task. The Australian adventure would last 6 months, and in early August, only 6 players had confirmed their availability. Sydney Barnes, widely considered as the greatest bowler in the world, but now 47, was initially included in the team. However, Barnes insisted that his wife accompany him for what would be a 6-month round trip. His invitation was withdrawn and he never played international cricket again. Barnes' pre-war new ball partner had been Warwickshire's fine left-arm seamer, Frank Foster. But his career had been ended after he broke his leg in a motorcycle accident during the war. This left England with severe shortages in their bowling attack. As for the batting, it speaks volumes that media reports were mooting the possibility of recalling the likes of C.B. Fry and Ranji, both then in their late 40s. The average age of the final squad was 34, and England's youngest player, Abe Waddington, was 27. England's uncertainty over their preparations was further demonstrated by indecision over the captaincy. Initially, Reggie Spooner, the Lancashire amateur, who also represented England at rugby union, was invited to captain the side, but he was forced to withdraw due to a knee injury. Instead, all-rounder Johnny Douglas, who had skippered England to Ashes success down under in 1911-12, agreed to take the lead. Douglas had a more than useful bowling record for Essex and England, and had been part of a successful seam attack in Australia 9 years earlier. He was an obdurate batsman, whose initials, JWHT, earned him the less than complimentary nickname Johnny Won't Hit Today from Australian hecklers. The son of a timber merchant, Douglas was also a renowned amateur boxer who had won the Olympic middleweight gold medal in 1908. For all England's difficulties, it should not be overlooked that the final travelling party that Douglas led contained some genuine giants of the game. Jack Hobbs was widely considered the greatest batsman in the world and became the most prolific scorer of runs and centuries in the history of first-class cricket. Frank Woolley and Patsy Hendren would go on to boast the second and third highest aggregates of first-class runs and joined Hobbs in England's batting lineup. Wilfred Rhodes, the game's most prolific wicket-taker, was also part of the team. These were players who would have been assets to any cricket side before or since. It was the 18th of September 1920 when England set sail from Tilbury on a steamer called the Hostilities. During the voyage, the Hostilities picked up a passenger who later went on to die of typhus in Colombo. Upon arrival in Fremantle, the England team were moved into Woodman Point Quarantine Station, where they stayed in army huts for a week. Facilities for practice were limited, and the time for the Western Australia match was reduced to 1 day. A shipping strike later caused the cancellation of their Tasmanian fixture. During November and early December, England won matches against South Australia, Victoria and Queensland, drew against an Australian 11, but lost against New South Wales. The Test series began in Sydney on the 17th of December 1920. It was the first Test match for over 6 years when England had been triumphant in South Africa. 6 of that team, Hobbs, Rhodes, Strudwick, Hearn, Woolley and Douglas, had appeared in that match. Sadly, one who wasn't present, Yorkshire seamer Major Booth, had been killed in the Battle of the Somme. Booth died in no man's land in the arms of Abe Waddington, who poignantly now made his debut, taking on the bowling role of his fallen comrade. Russell, Parkin and Hendren were also winning their first Test caps. Australia, for their part, had not played a Test in over 8 years. Like England, they had also lost a Test player in conflict, fast bowler Tibby Cotter. 3 of their team, McCartney, Kellaway and Bardsley, were present in their last match where they had lost heavily to England at the Oval. A 4th player, Warwick Armstrong, was not on that tour. Armstrong had been one of the Big Six who had refused to partake due to long-standing disputes with the Board of Control who governed Australian cricket. But now Armstrong was captain and the oldest player in a team with no fewer than 7 debutants. Maley, Pellew, Collins, Ryder, Gregory, Taylor and Oldfield were all sporting the baggy green for the first time. However, many of them had been part of the Australian Imperial Force Touring 11, which had performed impressively in England, South Africa and Australia in 1919 and 1920. Australia won the toss and Armstrong elected to bat first. The experienced Charles McCartney, who opened the batting with debutant Herbie Collins, was bowled by Abe Waddington with 40 on the score sheet, bringing another long-standing batsman, Warren Bardsley, to the crease. 40 more were added before Bardsley was caught behind by Strudwick off the bowling of young Jack Hearn. Collins was going well, and with Charles Kellaway took the score to 140 before being the victim of a run-out. This led to a mini-collapse for Australia. Kellaway was also run out before skipper Warwick Armstrong was stumped by Strudwick and Jack Gregory was caught by Strudwick off the left-arm bowling of Frank Woolley, leaving Australia 176 for 6. But Australia's batting depth paid dividends as Johnny Taylor and Nip Pellew steadied the innings and took the score past 200. They then both fell to the leg spin of Hearn, meaning Australia closed the first day on 250 for 8. Australia had not troubled the scorers the next morning when Jack Ryder became the 3rd run-out victim of their innings. Wicketkeeper Bert Oldfield and number 11, Arthur Maley, frustrated the bowlers before Cecil Parkin dismissed Oldfield, with Australia closing on 267. At this point, England were most definitely in the game. Could they surpass the Australian total? They could not have got off to a worse start when Essex batsman Jack Russell was bowled by Kellaway off the first ball of the innings, playing onto his stumps. Young Jack Hearn joined the master, Jack Hobbs, and put on a 50 stand before being dismissed by Arthur Maley's leg spin. The pace of Jack Gregory accounted for Hobbs 1 run short of his 50. Frank Woolley and Patsy Hendren took England's score into 3 figures, but shortly after Woolley's 50, Hendren and then Woolley himself were dismissed by Jack Ryder's part-time fast-medium bowling, leaving England on 145 for 5. Maley accounted for Wilfred Rhodes, Gregory dismissed Bill Hitch, Captain Johnny Douglas was stumped by Oldfield, also off the bowling of Maley. Abe Waddington was run out and Bert Strudwick was trapped LBW by Gregory, meaning England finished on just 190. With a first innings lead of 77, Australia must have scented blood that evening. Collins and Bardsley opened and took the score to 46 without loss by close of play. A rest day followed, but it did not rejuvenate England's bowling attack. England's new ball duo, Bill Hitch and Abe Waddington, were to go wicketless. Hitch had played his first test a decade earlier. A Lancastrian by birth, he plied his trade with Surrey. He was a late selection for this tour, having been drafted in when Sussex all-rounder Valence Jubb was unable to travel. He had made the journey to Australia separately from the rest of the England touring party, avoiding the quarantine. With a distinctive hopping run-up, his reputation for express pace was such that it was thought his bowling had reached speeds of 95 miles an hour in 1912 against Essex at Leighton. His first-class record was impressive, with over 1,300 wickets at an average of 21, even though his bowling sometimes lacked accuracy. However, he was now 34 years old, and his once impressive pace had waned. Although, on the third day, the Sydney Mail suggested that England's cause had not been helped by Douglas not bowling him until after tea. The 27-year-old Abe Waddington was a left-arm seamer from Yorkshire. His selection for this match had been contentious. Surrey's leg-spinning all-rounder Percy Fender later recounted that he had been instructed by Douglas to get changed for the game before hearing in the corridor just before the toss that Waddington would be preferred on account of his batting. If this were the reason, it was a bizarre one, as Waddington was a tail-ender, while the previous summer Fender had taken 35 minutes to score the fastest ever first-class century. It seems more probable that Douglas was wishing to repeat the tactics of when he was part of a seam and swing heavy attack which led England to a 4-1 victory in the 1911-12 tour with Sidney Barnes and Frank Foster. But now Douglas was in his late 30s and England's seamers a shadow of their predecessors from 9 years earlier. Bowling good length deliveries from a curved run-up, Waddington was known to move the ball away from the batsman. His action was described by Neville Cardus as gloriously rhythmical. Like Hitch, he boasted an excellent first-class record, taking over 800 wickets at an average of just 19. He also played as a goalkeeper for Halifax Town Football Club. He was a reputed amateur golfer and a keen motorcyclist who partook in the Isle of Man TT. Unfortunately, his form for Yorkshire was not to be replicated in this Ashes tour, where he won his only 2 England caps. While he was used in short bursts for his county, in Australia he was required to bowl longer, more defensive spells. His first innings dismissal of McCartney was to be his sole Test match wicket, and the Sheffield Daily Telegraph criticised him for his fielding and his questioning of the decisions of the umpires. It was up to the Middlesex leg spinner, young Jack Hearn, to finally make the breakthrough on the third day, bowling Bardsley, but only after the Australian openers had registered a century partnership. McCartney joined Collins at the crease, and the hosts continued to put the bowling to the sword. On his first test, Collins made a century. His 104 came in 278 balls and took 219 minutes. It was a characteristically watchful innings from a player renowned for his patience. Despite being new to the team, Collins was no rookie. He was 32 years old, and his first-class career for New South Wales stretched back over a decade. Short in stature, he played with little backlift. Ray Robinson compared his style to that of trench warfare. He was a popular player with his teammates, known for his ability to relate to a variety of different characters. Such personal skills would later stand him in good stead as captain of Australia, where he earned the nicknames Lucky and Horseshoe for his habit of winning the toss. Collins and McCartney had taken the score to 234 when Collins was caught off the bowling of Douglas. McCartney, whose imposing batting style earned him the moniker the Governor General, was to make 69 before being bowled by Douglas. Pellew was trapped LBW by Frank Woolley before Woolley caught Johnny Taylor off the bowling of Parkin. It was at this point that the Australian skipper, Warwick Armstrong, finally came to the crease. At 41 years of age, standing 6 foot 3 inches tall and weighing 21 stone, Armstrong cut an unmistakable figure on the field of play. His nickname, the Big Ship, conjures images of his enormous white shirt resembling a giant sail on a mast. By the time he was finished, the English bowling attack were all at sea. But for all his outward confidence, Armstrong's innings was shrouded in subplot. He was batting at 7th in the order, down from his preferred position of 5. Why was this? Gideon Hayes' excellent biography of Armstrong recounts that Armstrong's brother-in-law had suffered what would prove to be a fatal accident while trying to board a tram on his way to the second day's play. He was fighting for his life as Armstrong set out to bat, and from the pavilion there were murmurings. Armstrong's career had been characterised by altercations with the Australian cricketing authorities, to the extent that his appointment as captain was initially for just one match. With his deputy Collins making runs, Armstrong was acutely aware of those in the Australian Board of Control who would relish the opportunity to push for a change of captaincy and thus rid themselves of a troublesome character. Ray Robinson recalled that as he left the pavilion, a friend said to him, "They have a poor opinion of you, Warwick." Armstrong replied, "I'll show them. I'm going to make 100. He was true to his word. He made 158. Armstrong was ably supported by Charles Kellaway, a sound frontline batsman whose patience and solid defensive technique made him perfect in a crisis. Later in the series, at Adelaide, his 7-hour-long 147 earned him the sobriquet the Rock of Gibraltar. This time he made 78 before being caught by Russell off the bowling of Frank Woolley. Australia's second innings total of 581 was as colossal as their captain's shirt, destroying the statistics of the English bowlers in the process. Armstrong was eventually dismissed by Cecil Parkin, arguably the pick of England's bowlers, with 3 wickets. He was an off-spinner who had begun his career with Yorkshire until it was discovered that he was born 20 yards outside the county boundary. After 8 years in club cricket, he joined Lancashire, but until this tour, he had not been a full-time cricketer. Unlike many finger spinners, he deplored bowling to defensive fields. Known as a dressing room jester, he was a skilled conjurer and magician. His international career ended controversially in 1924 when he criticised his captain, Arthur Gilligan, in a newspaper article. Young Jack Hearn, who had taken 3 for 77 in the first innings, saw his bowling figures suffer. The Middlesex all-rounder was known as Young Jack to distinguish him from another Jack Hearn, who had previously served Middlesex and England with distinction as a medium-fast bowler in the 1890s. Young Jack was a distant cousin and enjoyed a prolific first-class career, scoring over 37,000 runs and taking over 1,800 wickets. Sadly, he could not replicate these achievements on this tour. He was to fall ill in the next test at Melbourne and miss the remainder of the series. Yorkshire's legendary slow left armer, Wilfred Rhodes, ended without a wicket. Although Douglas's seeming reluctance to bowl the most prolific first-class wicket-taker of all time was also a talking point, with unfounded rumours of a personality clash between Douglas and Rhodes. These were refuted by Rhodes, who asserted in a 1923 interview with the Daily Mail that he and Douglas were always friends and comrades, as were all the England team. However, on his underuse during the tour, Rhodes cryptically added, "Whether he had forgotten that I had headed the English averages with 161 wickets the season before going out, I do not know." Although Rhodes' main strength had originally been his bowling, during a test career which at over 30 years long was the longest in history, Rhodes was latterly selected for his batting. The development of Rhodes' batting skills had its own backstory. As a specialist left-arm spinner on his debut back in 1899, he batted down at number 10. Then came the emergence of Colin Blythe as a potential rival to Rhodes for the role of England's premier slow left armer. Perhaps aware of this, Rhodes began to demonstrate considerable aptitude in his batting, moving up to open for England with Jack Hobbs. This reached its zenith in 1912, when they shared a record 323-run opening partnership. Tragically, in 1917, Colin Blythe was killed on the battlefield in Belgium, leaving Rhodes as the most experienced of England's slow left armers. As proof of this, Rhodes topped the averages in the 1920 County Championship season, but at this point of his career, he was less effective on Australian wickets. Frank Woolley also provided a bowling option. Back in England, Woolley had enjoyed a prolific season with the ball. He could bowl slow left-arm spin or medium pace, but it is as one of England's finest left-handed batters that he came to be remembered. However, during this Ashes series, Johnny Douglas asked him to bowl over twice as many overs as Wilfred Rhodes. It was also thought that Woolley did not agree with how Douglas set the field to his bowling. Woolley had a quiet series with the bat, despite making some good starts. It is a matter of speculation whether his extended bowling duties affected his batting form. England had suffered 2 demoralising days in the field. Their bowlers had laboured with little joy. An exhausted team went into the final innings of the match, needing 659 runs to win. An impossible task. And so it proved. Only 5 runs were on the scoreboard when Russell was caught by wicketkeeper Bert Oldfield off the bowling of Jack Gregory. At the age of 25, Gregory was announcing himself as cricket's new superstar. He hailed from a cricketing family, and his much older cousin, Sid Gregory, enjoyed a 20-year Test career either side of the turn of the century. Jack was something of a force of nature. R.C. Robertson Glasgow described him as tall, strong and raw bones, like one of his native kangaroos. Jack Hobbs considered his approach to the crease to resemble an elephant stampede. He took a huge leap on delivery and was fearsomely quick. He batted left-handed, often without gloves or a box, and with the same wholehearted destructiveness as he bowled. A superb slip fielder, his skill set would surely have made him a priceless asset had he been playing the game 100 years later. Hobbs and Hearn put on a century stand. Then Hobbs was trapped LBW by who else but Warwick Armstrong. Armstrong was renowned as a tireless bowler who maintained a relentless length and whose leg break was difficult to distinguish from the delivery that held its line. The Master Hobbs led an illustrious list of batters who had fallen to his guiles. Hearn, who had bowled 76 overs during the Test, batted bravely and had passed 50 before being bowled by Gregory. And then Arthur Maylie got his first scalps of the innings, proving that if Gregory couldn't barge the door down, he could unpick the lock. Maylie had Woolley stumped by Oldfield and Douglas caught by Armstrong. The Sheffield Daily Telegraph alleged that the England captain had been reluctant to leave his wicket having been given out, pointing to the ground to suggest that the ball had bounced before Armstrong had claimed the catch. This report was to lead to criticism for Douglas in the media back home. In contrast to the parsimonious Armstrong, his fellow leg spinner, Arthur Maylie, was known as the millionaire bowler. In an era of timeless tests, Maylie understood that wickets might have to be bought at a heavy cost. He claimed to prefer to spin the ball and see it hit for 4 than to get a wicket from a ball which had failed to turn. With this philosophy, he was able to bear the pressure of adverse bowling figures lightly on his shoulders. Wilfred Rhodes said of him, "He never gave up. he would have 0 for 100 and might finish with 6 for 130. He would become the most successful bowler of the series with 36 wickets, an Ashes record which would remain for over half a century. Australia's wicket-keeper, Bert Oldfield, had now been involved in the dismissals of Russell and Woolley to go with his first innings stumping of Johnny Douglas. Less than 3 years earlier, at war in Belgium, he could not have imagined fulfilling his childhood dream of playing cricket for his country. He had been buried alive following bombardment in combat. He was discovered unconscious and spent many months suffering from shell shock, but escaped with his life to be Australia's gloveman for many years to come. Patsy Hendren scored a half-century before being bowled by Charles Kellaway, whose fast-medium swing bowling proved to be of equal value to his team as his batting. Kellaway took the final wicket of Parkin to win the match. England were dismissed for 281, with Gregory, Maley, Kellaway and Armstrong sharing the wickets. Warwick Armstrong had been vindicated. His team had won the match by 377 runs and had been superior in all departments. He would retain his captaincy, leading Australia to victory in all 5 tests of the series. Even the journey home would prove no solace for the beleaguered England players. Armstrong and his team were aboard the same ship where they would triumph again back in the mother country. It was a glorious conclusion to a controversial but magnificent career. As for Johnny Douglas, he remained England's captain through the whitewash, but after 2 further losses back in England, he was replaced by Lionel Tennyson. Nevertheless, he would play for England for another 4 years and continued to captain Essex until 1928. The disappointment in Australia is part of his story, but shouldn't define him. Although his tactics could be rigid, his team stayed publicly supportive of him as a character defined by bravery more than brilliance. And that courage was in evidence at the end of his life. In December 1930, he and his father were sailing back to Britain after buying timber in Finland when their ship collided with another in the fog. It is believed that in attempting to save his father, Johnny Douglas also drowned. He was 48 years old.